Tonight, 7 true horror stories about neighbors. The ones who seemed harmless. The ones you trusted. The ones who knew your schedule, your name, your spare key, and your weaknesses before you even knew they were watching. A woman in Tennessee who borrowed money with tears in her eyes and kept a notebook tracking which lies she'd told to which tenants. A man in New Mexico who returned every borrowed tool cleaner than he'd gotten it, because he'd been in your house anyway. Neighbors in Louisiana who started with noise complaints and ended with a fire. A trusted family friend in Georgia who needed to make one quick call and had a warrant out for his arrest. A man in Ohio who documented every movement on his street, including exactly how long the kids waited at the bus stop alone. A developer in Kentucky who said he was patient and meant it as a threat, and a retiree in Montana who pointed a camera at one window and one window only. Knoxville, Albuquerque, Shreveport, Savannah, Kettering, Lexington, Missoula. 7 stories, 7 survivors. Let's get into it. Story 1, Knoxville, Tennessee. Parkside Manor Apartments, Knoxville. The kind of building that looks fine in the listing photos and slightly less fine when you move in and notice the hallway smells like boiled cabbage and the elevator button for the 3rd floor sticks. My partner Dex and I had just moved from Nashville. New jobs, new start, first apartment that was just ours. We were 24. We thought we knew enough to be careful. We didn't know what careful actually looked like yet. Ruth was in 3C, 2 doors down. She met us in the hallway our first day with a plate of lemon bars and a story about her bad hip. She was maybe 65, small and rounded, with white hair she kept pinned up and reading glasses that were always sliding down her nose. She said she'd lived in the building 8 years, knew the super by first name, and if we ever needed anything at all, she was right down the hall. We thought that was lovely. We thought it was exactly the kind of neighbor you wanted when you were new somewhere. The first few requests were small. Could Dex reach the can of soup on her top shelf? Did I have a couple of Tylenol? Could one of us carry her laundry basket down to the machines because her shoulder had been bothering her? We didn't mind. She was older, she lived alone, and the requests took 3 minutes each. But by the 2nd month, a pattern was building that I couldn't quite name yet. The Tylenol became, could you pick up my prescription when you're out? The laundry basket became, could you drive me to my rheumatologist? It's just a few miles. And every request was wrapped in the same delivery. The hip, the shoulder, the bad knee, the loneliness, the daughter in Phoenix who never called. She'd catch us right when we were leaving. Always. 6:45 in the morning, Dex heading to work. 7 in the evening, me just getting home with groceries. She'd be there in her doorway like she'd been waiting. She'd ask for small things, apologize for asking, say she hated to be a bother, and then stand there in that cardigan with her hands clasped in front of her until one of us said yes. The first money request came on a Sunday. She said her pharmacy had flagged her insurance and she was short $30 for her blood pressure medication. She'd pay us back when her pension direct deposit cleared on Tuesday. We gave it to her. She thanked us with genuine-looking tears. Tuesday came and went. When Dex mentioned the $30, she looked genuinely confused, then remembered, then said the deposit had been delayed. It would definitely be there by Friday. It wasn't there by Friday. What was there by Friday was another request, $60 this time, for a phone bill, same promise, same tears. We gave it to her again. I know how this sounds, but here's the thing about what she was doing. The amounts were always just below the level where you'd feel okay making a scene. $30, $60. Once, $120 for part of her rent because the management had apparently made an error with her account. Each individual amount felt like something a decent person would give. It was only when Dex wrote it all down one night, after we'd lent her close to $400 over 10 weeks, that the shape of it became clear. We'd been running a ledger in our heads but never comparing notes out loud. She'd been counting on that. The other tenants started talking around month 3. The woman in 2A had given her $200 before she figured it out. The guy across the hall had lent his car twice and once come home to find it smelled like cigarettes and had 60 fewer miles than it should have. A couple who'd lived in 3D the year before had moved out 6 months into their lease. Nobody had a smoking gun. She never threatened. She never got angry. She was unfailingly warm, unfailingly sorry to ask, unfailingly grateful. The gratitude was part of it. It made you feel good about yourself each time until it didn't anymore. The end came on a Thursday night. Dex had come home early from a work event and was sitting at the kitchen table when we heard Ruth's voice through the wall. She was on the phone, laughing. Not the soft, apologetic laugh she used with us. A different laugh entirely, low and satisfied, the laugh of someone who'd had a good day at work. We both went still. Through the wall, we could hear her telling someone about the new tenants in 3A, the young ones. Nice kids. The boy especially, she said. Can't say no to face. She said she'd already gotten $350 out of us and the month wasn't even over. She mentioned keeping track of what story she'd told each person. She called it her system. She said it helped to make sure the stories didn't overlap. Dex was already on his phone recording. We listened for 4 more minutes. She outlined her plan for the retired teacher in 1B. She'd already cased out which stories would work, what vulnerabilities the woman had shown. She called it reading the room. We stopped paying. We stopped answering. When she knocked, and she knocked repeatedly with that soft, insistent rhythm, we didn't move. We filed a report with the building management. They said they'd look into it. 2 weeks later, we learned they'd already had multiple prior complaints about Ruth and had been slow-walking a formal eviction because she'd never technically violated any clause directly enough to act on. What tipped it was the recording. That and the fact that she'd apparently told the building manager's assistant that she was going to report a maintenance issue she'd fabricated, which finally irritated the right person. She was out by the end of the month. We saw her moving boxes into a pickup truck driven by someone we'd never seen. She didn't say goodbye, she didn't look up. I thought about following her to warn whoever lived near wherever she was going. I didn't. I still think about that sometimes. The system in that notebook. How many buildings she'd been through before ours. How good she was at reading the room. In Albuquerque, the borrowing started with a hammer. It always came back. That was the part that should have been the warning sign, not the asking, but the returning. Story 2, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Desert Pines Court, Albuquerque. One of those streets that's nicer than the name suggests. 2 rows of stucco duplexes, terracotta pots on the porches, the Sandia Mountains going pink every evening through the back windows. I'd moved there alone after finishing my master's, first real job, first time living in a place that felt like an adult's home rather than a student's. My duplex neighbor was a man named Gary, late 40s, works from home type, always in the same gray fleece no matter the temperature. He introduced himself my first week, mentioned he did IT consulting, said the building was quiet and he liked it that way. Normal, unremarkable. The kind of neighbor you forget 5 seconds after talking to him. The borrowing started about 3 weeks in. He needed a Phillips head screwdriver to mount a TV bracket. Would I mind? I lent it. It came back the next morning in a Ziploc bag, clean, with a sticky note that said, "Thanks, Gary." That was the rhythm he established immediately. Borrow, return promptly, return it cleaner than it came. The drill, the level, a crescent wrench. Each item came back quickly, often with a small courtesy attached, a returned favor or a note. It made him feel considered, reliable, careful. By month 2, he was borrowing things from inside my house. He'd knock and ask to borrow my extension cord, the long orange one in the hallway closet, and I'd go get it and hand it to him at the door. Or my box fan, or the folding table I'd never unpacked. These were reasonable requests between neighbors. I wasn't suspicious. I was just slightly inconvenienced, which felt uncharitable to feel. The thing that changed everything was my passport. I'd had it since college, a specific place in a specific drawer, same spot for years. I needed it for a work trip in late October and it wasn't there. I tore the drawer apart, checked every folder in my filing cabinet, looked behind the cabinet, under the cabinet, nothing. I found my birth certificate, my social security card, my car title, but the passport was gone. I spent a Saturday turning my apartment inside out. No passport. I almost wrote it off as misplaced when I noticed something else. The stack of bank statements I kept paper-clipped in order in the third drawer was fanned out slightly differently than I'd left it. Not enough that someone careless would notice. But I'm organized in a specific way because I have to be. I handle my finances carefully. I use a system. I put things back in the same order every time. Someone had been through the drawer, carefully, thoughtfully, almost correctly. I started looking for other things. My spare credit card, the one I kept in the filing cabinet for emergencies, rarely used, was in the wrong sleeve. A folder I kept behind the others had been moved to the front. Nothing missing that I could identify except the passport. But everything had been handled. The only person who'd been inside my apartment recently, the only person with any reason to move through rooms I wasn't standing in, was Gary. He'd borrowed the folding table 3 weeks before and I'd left him inside while I took a call. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Enough time. I didn't accuse him. I changed my locks instead, quietly, and started paying attention to my credit report. The first flag came 6 weeks later, a hard inquiry from a car financing company I'd never contacted, in a city I'd never been to. Then a second inquiry, a retail credit account opened in my name at a store 2 states away, $140 purchase on the day it opened. I called the fraud hotline. They asked when I'd last had my identifying documents accessed. I told them about the passport, about Gary, about the drawer. The detective who eventually came out to take my statement asked if I'd noticed anything else unusual. I told him about the clean returns, the notes, the way he'd always asked in person so he could see inside the apartment. She, the detective, was a woman, Detective Marin, said that was consistent with what they called a social engineering approach. She said they'd seen it before. Someone builds a reputation for being considerate and harmless so that access feels like nothing, so that you don't think twice when they're in your hallway for 15 minutes. Gary was gone by the time they came to question him. Not fled dramatically, just not there. A different car in the driveway, a forwarding address that turned out to be a mail drop. The name on his lease wasn't Gary. Detective Marin said the identity he'd used to rent the duplex had been lifted from someone in Phoenix 5 years earlier. They found my passport in the storage unit attached to the duplex. He'd left it there, presumably no longer needed after he'd photographed it, along with documents that had belonged to 3 of my neighbors on the same street. One woman's identity had been used to open 11 accounts over 2 years. She didn't find out until a collection call. I've moved since then. I get my credit report pulled every 4 months. I've never lent anything to a neighbor that required them to be inside my home since. The thing I can't shake is the sticky notes, the little thank yous. He put them on every single item he returned. Not because he was grateful, because he was building a character. It worked. It worked until it didn't. Shreveport, Louisiana. The back neighbors seemed harmless at first. They were the kind of strange you tell yourself is just eccentric. It took a broken shed lock and a chemical smell to realize it was something else entirely. Story 3, Shreveport, Louisiana. Oleander Street, Shreveport. The four of us had rented the house together, me, my cousin Bren, and two friends from college, Terry and Marcus, mostly because it was the only way to afford a place with a real backyard in a neighborhood that didn't feel actively dangerous. The house was old but solid. Big covered porch in front, a deep yard in the back with a pecan tree and a wood storage shed, and a 6-foot privacy fence that backed up to the alley. The neighbors on the other side of that fence moved in about 2 months after we did. We didn't meet them right away. We heard them. Music at odd hours, not loud enough to be a nuisance but inconsistent, like the house had no schedule. When we did see someone back there, it was usually just a pair of hands gripping the fence rail and a voice asking if we had jumper cables or if we'd seen a calico cat. The first person we actually saw properly was a man named Dale, maybe 50, gaunt in the way that looks earned over years rather than deliberate. He wore the same sleeveless undershirt almost every time. He'd lean on the fence when Marcus was grilling on weekends and make conversation that went in strange directions. He'd ask about our jobs, then pivot to asking whether we'd noticed any helicopter activity over the neighborhood, whether we'd seen any government vehicles parked for longer than they should be. We smiled and nodded and passed him a plate of food once because Bren is generous to a fault. The second person was younger, maybe late 20s, never introduced himself, referred to by Dale as my sister's boy. He'd appear suddenly at the fence, talk very fast about something unrelated to whatever was happening and disappear again. His eyes had that quality where the pupils stayed small even in the shade. We all noticed it, but none of us said it out loud for a while. The shed went first. Marcus had gone out to get the lawn mower and found the padlock destroyed, not cut, not picked, smashed with something heavy until the hasp pulled free. Inside, the lawn mower was partially disassembled, the copper motor windings pulled out. The gas can was gone, some old extension cords. A bottle of acetone we'd used for a floor project. We called the police. They came, took a report, looked at the fence, looked at the shed, asked if we had any security cameras. We didn't. They said they'd note it. What they didn't say was that this particular block had 3 open reports from the previous 6 months, all describing similar thefts: copper wire, fuel, chemical solvents. Selective, specific, not random. Marcus found the first glass pipe behind the riding mower the following weekend, cleaning up after the police visit. Burned at one end. The smell coming off it explained the smell that sometimes drifted over the fence on humid evenings. That particular combination of something chemical and something rotting that doesn't smell like anything natural. Bren Googled it. We had a long, quiet conversation that night about what we were actually dealing with and what our options were. The motion lights started going off at 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. and randomly throughout the night. We'd look out and see nothing. Then one morning we found them tilted, aimed toward the house rather than the fence line. Someone had manually adjusted them. There were scuff marks on the wall below, at head height, where someone had braced themselves to reach. We started sleeping with our phones on. 3 weeks after the shed, Marcus heard glass and came downstairs to find the back window cracked, not broken, just the inner pane spiderwebbed from a blow that hadn't been hard enough to come through. Outside, 2 people were in our yard, not attempting to enter. Just standing there, one near the shed, one near the pecan tree. When Bren turned the porch light on, they walked back to the fence, not ran, walked, and one of them paused at the top of the fence and looked back at us. It was Dale's nephew. He wasn't wearing a shirt despite it being February. His face in the porch light looked like it had aged 10 years since the first time I'd seen him at the fence. The police came this time in under 20 minutes because Marcus told them there were intruders actively on the property. The people in our yard were gone by then, but the officers knocked on the back neighbor's front door. We heard it all from our porch, raised voices. Dale insisting he didn't know anything, the nephew apparently not home. The officers came back to tell us they couldn't make an arrest based on what they'd seen, but they were going to flag the address. The building was a known problem, they said. Had been for a while. That language, a known problem, told us everything we needed to know about how much institutional attention was actually being paid. The fire started on a Thursday night in late March. We smelled it before we saw it, that same chemical edge from before, now strong and dense. The shed was already fully involved when we got to the back window. Paint thinner and gasoline, the fire marshal said later. Accelerant pattern showed someone had poured it along 3 sides deliberately. The fence between our properties was charred when they got it out. We evacuated. All 4 of us out the front, neighbors across the street helping us drag out what we could. The fire department did their job fast enough that the house itself was spared. The shed was a total loss. The police and fire marshal arrived at the back neighbor's house within about an hour of each other. The probable cause for the search warrant came from the fire investigation, and the search turned up what we later heard described officially as a small-scale production operation in the rear bathroom, and a storage arrangement in the garage that included items reported stolen from 8 different properties in the surrounding blocks. 6 people were arrested that night, including Dale and the nephew. We moved out the following month, not because the house was unsafe, but because we were tired all the way through. Bren said she couldn't watch television in the living room anymore without her attention going to the back window. Some things are too attached to a place to come with you when you leave. You just have to leave them there and start somewhere else. We're halfway through. Drop a comment with which story hit hardest. It helps other people find this. Savannah, Georgia. She was 16 and home alone when a man she'd known her whole life knocked on the front door and asked to come in. She let him. She found out why he was sweating 3 minutes later. Story 4, Savannah, Georgia. Mosswood Drive, Savannah. Spanish moss and old oaks and houses that have been there so long they've settled into the ground. My aunt's neighborhood. The kind of street where everyone knew which car belonged to which driveway, and the mailman waved at you by name. I was 16 that summer. My Aunt Pamela worked night shifts at the hospital and slept days, and I was staying with her for 6 weeks while my parents were overseas. It was a Tuesday afternoon, mid-July, heat so thick outside you could feel it pressing on the windows. I was in the living room when the knock came. Through the peephole, I could see Mr. Calloway from 3 houses down. I'd known him since I was 8. He and my aunt had been on the same block for over a decade. He helped her with her gutters after every storm. He brought her tomatoes from his garden in the summer. He was the kind of person you meant when you said trusted neighbor. I opened the door. He was sweating heavily, even for July. His polo shirt had dark patches under the arms, and he was shifting his weight in a way I didn't associate with him. Jittery, compressed, like he was trying to take up less space than he usually did. He said he'd locked himself out of his house, and his wife was in Colombia visiting her sister. Said his phone was dead and he needed to make one call about something urgent. Work thing. He held up the phone, screen completely black, and gave me that familiar smile that didn't quite reach all the way to his eyes. I let him in. He was Mr. Calloway. I knew him. He followed me to the kitchen, and I pointed to the wall phone my aunt still kept because she said cell service was unreliable. He picked it up and held it for a moment without dialing, looking at it. Then he dialed. The conversation was strange, hushed, clipped, nothing about a work emergency. Things like "I know and there's nothing I can do right now and give me a few hours." His free hand was white-knuckled on the counter edge the whole time. He hung up after maybe 2 minutes and said, "Thanks, I appreciate it, I should get going." Then he stopped. Said, "Actually, do you mind if I sit down a minute?" Said he felt a little light-headed from the heat. He sat down at the kitchen table without waiting for an answer, and that was when we heard it. Hard knocking at the front door. Not a neighbor knock, the kind of knock that announces itself. Mr. Calloway went rigid. Not startled rigid, but bracing rigid, like someone who'd been waiting to hear that sound. He stood up from the table and said, "Is there a back way out? Your aunt's backyard, can I cut through?" Before I could answer, a voice outside identified itself as a police officer and said they knew someone was inside. Mr. Calloway looked at me, not desperately, not frighteningly, just steadily, and said, "I'm sorry to involve you in this." Then he went into the hallway and stood there like he wasn't sure which direction to choose. I went to the front door. 2 officers. I'd met one of them at my aunt's block association meeting the previous year. She recognized me too. She said they were looking for Mr. Calloway in connection with a financial investigation. An employer had reported funds missing, a significant amount, and he'd missed a mandatory meeting with investigators that morning. His car was at his house. They knew he hadn't left on foot in this heat without going somewhere nearby. "Is he here?" she asked. She didn't say it accusingly. She said it like she already knew and was giving me a way to confirm without making it harder for either of us. I stepped back from the door. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no. I just stepped back. She walked in with her partner and Mr. Calloway was still standing in the hallway. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He held up one hand and said, "All right," and let them walk him out to the car. As they took him past me in the doorway, he said, and I've thought about this sentence many times since, sometimes people who have never made a mistake in 30 years make one catastrophic decision and then don't know how to stop it from getting bigger. He wasn't asking for sympathy. I think he was just saying it because it was true and there was no one else to say it to. I called my aunt at the hospital. She came home early. She cried a little when I told her about Mr. Calloway, not for herself but for his wife, who she called immediately. The money, nearly $150,000 taken over 2 years from the architectural firm where he'd been controller, was mostly gone. He'd paid off debts he was too ashamed to tell anyone about, and then paid off the consequences of those payments, and it had accumulated the way those things do when you keep choosing the wrong solution to the last mistake. He pleaded guilty. I heard it through my aunt's version of events, and then from the local paper. 18 months. He's probably out by now. My aunt still lives on Mosswood Drive. She still leaves her tomato plants in the same corner where his used to grow against the fence. She never said a word against him to the neighbors. She said it wasn't her place. I think about that afternoon when I let someone in because I knew his face and forgot that familiar faces are still attached to people who can be in the middle of something you know nothing about. I'm not angry at him for that. I'm just different because of it. Kettering, Ohio. The man 2 houses down wasn't angry. He wasn't erratic. He was methodical. He had a color-coded map of the cul-de-sac and a file on every family, including how long each set of kids stood at the bus stop before an adult came back inside. Story 5. Kettering, Ohio. Birchwood Circle, Kettering. Quiet suburban cul-de-sac. 8 houses in a ring. Big oaks that were already there before any of the houses were. The kind of street that shows up in real estate listings as established and family-friendly, which it genuinely was. My wife Jenna and I had lived there 6 years with our daughters, Nora and Simone, 8 and 11. We knew everyone. Block parties twice a year, a group chat for snow removal coordination. Actual community, the kind that takes years to build and that you don't fully appreciate until something cracks it. The man who moved into the yellow house at the far end of the circle in late February was named Prescott. We didn't know his first name for a while. He didn't offer it. He was probably late 50s, heavyset, always in the same tucked-in polo and khaki shorts combination regardless of the season. He walked with this pausing gait, like he was counting steps or confirming something between each one. My wife brought him a lasagna his first week, the way she does with all new neighbors. He took it through a barely opened door and thanked her in a way that felt more like dismissal than gratitude. The lasagna dish came back a week later, clean, left on our porch with no note. The first camera went up on his garage within 10 days, then another at the corner of his roof, then a third above his front door pointed outward rather than at his own property. By the end of his third week, he had 4 cameras, which was notable but not alarming by itself. People have cameras. What started the group chat buzzing was the camcorder. A physical handheld camcorder, older model, the kind with a flip screen. He'd stand in his driveway with it and film the street for 20, sometimes 30 minutes at a time. Not concealed, not pretending to do something else, just openly recording. My neighbor Bill, who lives 2 houses from me, got the first note. Under his truck's windshield wiper, Monday morning. Handwritten in pressed ballpoint that had torn through the paper in places. Specific complaints about Bill's diesel engine startup time, logged with dates and durations going back 2.5 weeks. At the bottom, the license plate number written 3 times. We all laughed about it at first. Then Stacy across the circle got one about her wind chimes. The Garcias got one about their recycling bin angle. Mr. Petrov, who's 81, who has lived on this street since before I was born, received a 2-page document about his vegetable garden attracting pest birds. Each note grew more detailed, the handwriting more pressured, the language more official sounding. He'd started adding diagrams, property sketches with measurements, printed photos from his recordings with red circles. Then one note, slipped under the Garcia's front door, included what appeared to be a crayon drawing of a person lying down with X's for eyes. That one we photographed and kept. Bill and I went over on a Saturday with a 6-pack, trying to do the reasonable adults thing. Prescott came to the door in rubber gloves and a surgical mask. He didn't invite us in. Through the barely open door, we could see filing cabinets along the wall, each labeled with our addresses in label maker tape. He listened to us explain that the notes were making people uncomfortable, then pulled a spiral notebook from his shirt pocket and began reading aloud from it. Violations he'd logged that morning alone. The angle of my mowing stripes. How many times Bill's dog had barked, 17 apparently, and a complaint about an ethnic smell from the Petrov kitchen that made both Bill and me go very still. When we tried to respond, he went purple and started poking his finger at us, saying we were conspiring to push him out because he was the only one who maintained standards. We left. The breaking point was a Wednesday in May. The Garcia twins, 10 years old, playing with water guns in their yard, got water on his driveway. By the time I got to their yard, Prescott was standing too close to those boys with his camcorder in one hand and a garden hose in the other, spraying them. His face was doing something I'd never seen a face do before, pure irrational rage braided with something colder underneath it. When their mother came out from the house and put herself between him and her sons, he turned the hose on her. And then, very calmly, he looked at those boys and said, "Your mother can't protect you every minute. I know when you wait for the bus. I know when you're alone." He said alone the way you'd say checkmate. Bill got there before me and grabbed his wrist until he dropped the camcorder. Neighbors poured out of every house. Stacy, Mr. Petrov with his gardening gloves still on. We stood in a ring around the Garcias. Prescott went to his knees on the lawn and started pulling up grass with his bare hands, throwing it at us, screaming about evidence and files. He reached for his shirt pocket and pulled out a smaller camera, a spy pen type. Bill took that too. The officers arrived in 9 minutes. The younger one looked shaken after 5 minutes at the scene. The sergeant, she'd been on the job long enough to read what she was looking at, changed her expression when she saw the folder Prescott had pulled from his shirt, soaked and scattered across the Garcia lawn. Photos with timestamps, transcripts of conversations, a hand-drawn map of the circle in multiple colored inks, everyone's daily routines charted out, and pages focused specifically on the kids. When they were home, when they were outside, when no adult had been visible for more than 5 minutes. As they walked him to the car, Prescott turned to me and said in a sing-song voice, "The electrician leaves at 7:23. Wife home alone, 8:15 to 4:30. Children at the bus stop 7:45, unsupervised for 6 minutes. The sergeant's younger partner stopped writing. He just stared. Prescott's house had, the sergeant told us in a follow-up visit, surveillance infrastructure she said she hadn't seen in a residential property outside of a professional context. Hidden cameras in fake rocks along the property line. One in a birdhouse. One disguised as a doorbell camera that had a field of view covering nearly the entire circle. Filing cabinets for each family, subsections for each member. The basement held a scale model of the cul-de-sac built from cardboard and craft sticks, with movable figures representing each of us. Some figures had red X's. She wouldn't tell us what his notebook said about those. I still drive past that yellow house sometimes. The for sale sign has been there so long it's gone gray at the edges. Nobody's come to look at it. Word gets around. In Lexington, he showed up at the door with a folder and said he wanted to buy the house. When she said no, he said he was patient. She didn't understand what he meant by that until the tires. Story 6, Lexington, Kentucky. Creekside Drive, Lexington. We'd been in that house 7 years. My husband Paul and I, our son Marcus who was 12, and our dog, a shepherd mix named Dolly who was afraid of her own reflection. The house was a 1970s colonial on a half-acre lot that backed up to a small drainage creek. We'd put 5 years of weekends into it. Paul's workshop in the garage. My vegetable garden along the south side. The pergola we built together over 2 summers, post by post. It was ours in the way a place is yours when you've fixed everything that's ever broken in it. The man 3 houses down had built a new house on the empty lot 2 years after we arrived. His name was Rutherford, and his house was the kind that announces money without any subtlety. Circular driveway, 4-car garage, a fountain in front that ran even in November. He'd been polite at neighborhood events, the kind of polite that stays at the surface and doesn't invite anything back. He knocked on our door on a Saturday morning in October with a folder under his arm, dressed like he was going to a meeting. He wanted to buy our property. He explained it calmly and with a lot of data, comparable sales, projected appreciation, the development he envisioned. He knew what we'd paid for the house. He knew Paul's job, that I worked at the school district. He'd done research. We said thank you and no. He left his card on top of the folder and said the offer was open. He came back 3 more times over the next month. Different angles each visit, once with architectural renderings, once with his wife who touched my arm while talking about what we could do with the money, once alone in the evening talking about maintenance costs and how unexpected repairs could spiral. That 4th visit, he said I'm a patient man in response to us telling him again that this was our home and we had no interest in selling. The way he said it. I'm a patient man. Paul and I talked about it after he left. It didn't sit right, but it also wasn't a threat we could name. 2 weeks later, Monday morning, Paul went to the car and found all 4 tires slashed. Not deflated, cut, cleanly and specifically, each one in a place that made them irreparable. Our neighbor, Mrs. Liao, had heard someone in our driveway around 3 a.m. but hadn't looked out because she didn't want to be nosy. She described the sound as methodical, like someone who knew what they were doing. The police took a report. Without a witness or footage, there was nothing actionable. They suggested security lighting. The mailbox was next, caved in with something heavy. Our mail scattered across the lawn. The junk mail destroyed. Our personal correspondence and Marcus's birthday party invitation from his friend, carefully placed on the porch steps and weighted with a rock so they wouldn't blow away. That detail, the careful preservation of what mattered, was the message. Someone wanted us to know they knew the difference. I watched Rutherford's house from our living room the evening we cleaned up the mailbox. He was in his driveway beside his car when we came out, not getting anything from the car, not going anywhere, just standing there with his arms crossed watching us pick up our mail. Then came the Saturday we took Marcus to his game and came home to an open front door. Nothing stolen, nothing visibly disturbed. But things moved, pictures turned backward, cabinet doors opened to exactly the same angle, the kids' outfits laid out on their beds with their arms and legs positioned naturally, and where each head would be a printout of our original home listing. I know what it sounds like, but we were in our house looking at this and there was no other reading. We called the police. Breaking and entering was a felony. The detectives said they'd investigate. When I mentioned Rutherford, the officer wrote it down without much expression. Rich neighbor wants to buy house wasn't probable cause, especially since Rutherford had a country club alibi for that morning with 40 people who'd seen him. That night Paul drove to Rutherford's house. He came back an hour later with the story. Rutherford had invited him in for coffee. In his study, aerial photos of our block covered the wall. Property survey maps with our lot outlined in red, and on his desk a scale model of what the block could look like with our house removed, replaced by a pool house and extended garden. He'd shown Paul a leather journal, 2 years of logged disturbances from our property, our dog barking, Marcus's basketball rolling into the yard. Our garbage can set out early. He called it documentation. He said property disputes could become very complicated when code enforcement was involved. Said our shed was 18 inches over the setback line. Said he hoped we'd start feeling safer soon and that moving could be such a stressful experience, but sometimes it was the right solution for everyone. Paul came home and I could see it on his face before he said anything. Laura, that's what I go by at work. Paul calls me by my full name, started making calls. She called her brother, who does commercial real estate, to start pulling Rutherford's business interests. She called her cousin, who does investigative work. And then she called 2 people she knew who knew people at the firm that managed Rutherford's development company. Because she'd found out on her Sunday research that he was in the final stages of a major deal with overseas investors, hundreds of millions, and any scandal could terminate it. She'd also found that he'd done this twice before in other states. Same approach, same escalation, different families who'd eventually moved. By midnight, she had a folder thicker than the one he'd brought to our door on that first Saturday morning. She went to his business partner's offices the next day. I don't know exactly what she said. She came home with that particular expression she gets when a difficult parent at school has finally understood that she means it. 2 days before the deadline, he'd written in a note, "Final offer, decision needed by Friday." A moving truck appeared in his driveway. By Thursday evening, the house was empty. His company announced a restructuring within the month. We stayed. The pergola is still there. The garden came back the following spring. We added a security system, good cameras, which is the one thing I wish we'd done from the beginning. The check he'd left us, triple the house's value, a cashier's check, slipped through our mail slot with a contract already filled out, is framed in our hallway. Not because we're proud of what happened, because Rutherford was right that documentation is useful. We just turned out to be better at it than he was. Last one, Missoula, Montana. The retired man 2 houses down had a camera he'd installed himself. He thought he'd hidden it. He hadn't. But by the time anyone noticed, he'd been watching for 11 months. Story 7, Missoula, Montana. Tamarack Street, Missoula. The kind of neighborhood where people still wave from their porches, and the mountains are visible from the end of the block. I'd moved there alone after a job change. Remote accounting work, which meant I was home most of the day, but my schedule was unpredictable, variable. Some days out by 7, some days not at all, some days leaving twice. I thought that variability would make me hard to track. I was wrong about that. The man 2 houses down was named Cliff, retired, probably in his early 70s. He was on his porch most mornings with a mug, and he was on it most evenings too. When I moved in, he brought over a bag of tomatoes from his garden and shook my hand and told me the neighborhood association met on the second Thursday of the month if I was interested. Helpful, neighborly, normal. The first month I was on Tamarack Street, I barely thought about him. He was just a figure on a porch. Something I registered peripherally, the way you register background details. But I started noticing, somewhere around week 5, that he was always there when I was leaving. Not sometimes, every time. I'd back out of the driveway at 6:45 and he'd be on the porch. I'd leave at 11 for a midday errand and he'd be watering the front planters. I'd come home at 8 p.m. and he'd be there in the early dark. I told myself he was just retired, nowhere else to be. But the brain notices patterns before it names them, and mine was noticing something it couldn't quite say out loud yet. I started testing it. I'd decide on a time to leave and then change it by an hour at the last minute. He was still there. I left through my back door one morning, parked my car down the street the night before, and walked to it through the alley. When I drove past the front of his house, he was on his porch. I don't know how he was doing it. That was when I started looking. I found the camera on a Sunday afternoon when the light was at the right angle. It was tucked into the gap between his garage siding and the gutter, small, black, mounted on a bracket, aimed not at his own driveway but at mine, at my front windows. Framed to catch whoever came and went from my property. I went inside and sat down and tried to figure out what I was feeling, which turned out to be less fear than I expected and more a quiet, specific anger. This man had been watching, methodically, consistently, for months. Not because I'd given him a reason, because I was there and he decided I was worth watching. I called the non-emergency line. 2 officers came, listened to what I showed them, walked to the camera, confirmed what I was describing, and then walked to Cliff's house and knocked. I watched from my window. Cliff answered. There was a conversation I couldn't hear, some gesturing, some pointing at the street. After several minutes, one of the officers reached up and removed the camera from its bracket. They came back and told me he'd said it was for neighborhood safety. They told him that regardless of his intent, a camera aimed into a private residence's driveway, and Windows was not legal to maintain, and they'd required him to remove it. They suggested I install my own cameras if I wanted documentation going forward. They left. That was the response. I won't pretend it felt like enough. Cliff was still there the next morning on his porch, still there when I left, still there when I came home. But without the camera, something had shifted, the way a room changes when you remove one specific object from it. He knew I'd seen it. He knew I'd called. He was still watching, but he knew I knew, and that changed the nature of it even if it didn't change what he was doing. I installed my own cameras within the week. I started keeping my curtains drawn in rooms that faced his direction. I stopped waving back when he waved. After about 2 months, his appearances on the porch became less timed. He'd be out there and I'd leave and he wouldn't look up. Whether that was because the thrill was gone or because he'd found another way, I can't tell you. I don't know what he was logging before the camera came down. I don't know how many of my routines he'd cataloged, what patterns he'd mapped, what he'd been looking for. The not knowing is its own kind of ongoing. I've moved since then, different city, different street. Before I signed the lease, I walked the block twice at different times of day looking at what faced my windows. I know how that sounds. That's fine. Some things you do differently after. I don't think Cliff was dangerous in the way that word usually means. But what he was doing wasn't nothing. A camera pointed at your home by someone who had no right to watch is a statement about who owns your privacy. He thought he did. The officers disagreed. That's as good an ending as it gets some days. That's it. 7 stories from 7 different streets across America. The thing they have in common isn't the town or the crime or even the person involved. It's the word familiar. Every one of these people was familiar, known, trusted enough that when they knocked, the door opened. When they asked, the answer was yes. When they were there every morning, it read as routine instead of surveillance. Familiar is the thing that gets you. It lowers your guard on purpose. It waits. If someone in your life is giving you that feeling, the one you can't quite name, the one you keep explaining away, trust it. Document what you observe. Tell people. You don't need proof to take your own discomfort seriously. You don't need to wait for it to get worse to act like it's real. If these kept you listening, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're from. It helps the algorithm find people who need to hear this. Trust your gut, and we'll see you in the next one.